Hello, Write the Docs Atlantic. Thank you for having us. I'm Adam Trujillo.
And I'm Jeff Boruszak.
We're two of the technical writers at HashiCorp. We write documentation for Console, a networking solution for multi-cloud service architectures. And we want to walk you through a project we began last August to address the structural aspects of our documentation. Today, we'll tell you about our ongoing efforts to understand and improve our product's information architecture, or IA. We'll discuss how we decided to focus on our information architecture, how we determined the aspects of the IA to address, and the in-house usability testing we undertook to get meaningful and actionable insights about our docs. Before we continue, we'll introduce ourselves. I joined HashiCorp in 2021 as one of the first technical writers on the education team. I began my career as a tech journalist covering data center management before switching to documenting software for end users in 2008. I'm originally from a small town in rural southern Colorado and I'm currently based in Los Angeles.
And I joined Adam as a technical writer at HashiCorp in April 2022. I previously worked on Google's Help Center documentation, and before technical writing, I earned my PhD in English studying American poetry. I'm currently in the Bay Area, and I was based in Austin, Texas before that. Our goal with this presentation today is to leave you with practical takeaways you can use to study and improve your own docs. Some of the things we learned during this project are broadly applicable to many different kinds of documentation. So we're going to tell you about the assumptions and hypotheses that we tested, and a few of the do's and don'ts we learned along the way. Our hope is that this presentation provides a repeatable starting point for similar information architecture projects. To that end, we think it's important to acknowledge that the project we discussed today is ongoing. This presentation describes efforts that produce meaningful deliverables in a single quarter. But a full year has now passed, and we're still working on implementing our larger vision for RIA. Information architecture projects can be expansive, so we hope that our presentation also helps you plan your IA projects and manage stakeholder expectations along the way.
All right, getting back to our story. Our project took off when our product leadership made it a priority to fix the docs. People, internal and external to the organization, had been unhappy about the state of the documentation for a long time and wanted it addressed yesterday. At the same time, we were preparing to launch a new platform for hosting all of our educational content at the end of the quarter, so it seemed to be the ideal time to finally fix our docs once and for all. The actual request from our product leadership was to fix the documentation by simply reorganizing it. After all, the information was all there, it just needed to be presented in a way that users could more easily find what they're looking for.
I'm sure many of the writers in the audience have received similar requests at some point. And there are a lot of challenges to responding to this kind of content request. Fixing the documentation is a broad directive. It can mean so many things. So how do we determine what to do in the first place? Also, while a quarter is a typical planning unit, it isn't a realistic time frame for introducing significant and well-thought-out documentation changes. Also, the product's development and marketing is subject to dizzying velocity and sudden changes. So in order to fulfill this request, we need to make a plan for our documentation that works for our product as it exists now and as it exists in the future. It's certainly a challenging task. But we also saw this request as an opportunity, a general mandate from our product stakeholders to make wide-ranging improvements to the product's documentation. So while we didn't have the luxuries like more resources in our budget, we set about this task with the goal of creating concrete deliverables that improve our docs' usability in ways we could actively measure.
To be clear, we really wanted to restructure the docs. At the time, product information was split between a core documentation set and a series of tutorials hosted on separate web domain. That may be challenging enough for users, but there wasn't clear guidance from a publishing perspective on what kinds of information should be presented in a tutorial versus the core product documentation. As a result, our practitioners didn't really know where to look for help. The good news was that the unpleasant experience of navigating the domains was already being addressed by consolidating them into a new developer portal. The portal was scheduled to launch at the company's conference at the end of the quarter, but beyond combining documentation and tutorials into a single website, How could we improve the user experience for our product documentation? One of the challenges for us is that Console is a newer software offering in an emerging field where things are constantly changing. So there weren't really any direct models for what the docs should even look like. Even market peers that provide service discovery and service mesh tools are built differently and have different usage patterns. And with this in mind, we needed to understand what a good IA even looked like before we could even understand what improving our information architecture looked like.
So what exactly do we mean when we talk about IA? To people outside the field of technical communications, information architecture is an umbrella term for many aspects of a documentation set, from the naming and placement of navigational elements in a browser, to the guidelines and organizational rules that determine how the folders and pages are named and nested. But at its core, IA is a lot more than that. It's the structural blueprint for developing a sustainable and consistent information ecosystem. It enables a documentation set to scale strategically without constant manual effort. In our view, the main advantage of creating a documentation information architecture is to create a system for adding and removing support content strategically, such that it maximizes usability for the target audience by allowing them to quickly and predictably find information in the documentation set. With that goal for our IA in mind, we began by setting a North Star principle for our project, something that, if we got lost, we could return to find guidance. Based on the other projects we had in our pipeline and the time we had available to complete our work, we decided on the following North Star for our deadline at the end of the quarter. We can reorganize our existing content, but we can't implement an IA that will require us to write new content on a large scale. With a guiding principle, we began an analysis phase. We wanted to figure out what improving the IA looks like in the short and long term. So we looked at documentation sets for open source products, cloud enterprise products, and totally unrelated software that our colleagues on the education team suggested when we asked them about helpful doc sets they used before. While analyzing these doc sets, we were particularly impressed by the Auth0 docs. So with our limited time today, we'd like to use the Auth0 docs as an example to show you some of the key lessons we learned about information architecture.
The Auth0 documentation provides a map for users to follow and branches into different workflows depending on the specific user journey. When you click on one of the icons, you're taken to an overview page that clearly describes the content it contains. The documentation appears to be well organized and thoughtfully constructed because it combines a primary path through the documentation and branches to optional paths relevant to the specific subsets of users. Knowing that something like this probably wasn't the first draft, we used the Wayback Machine to view previous iterations of their docs and hopefully learn something about the process. In the late 2017 snapshot of the documentation, you can see a general topic-based organization schema with high-level entry points into the documentation. But the docs are curated content that assume the reader has enough technical knowledge to find what they're looking for. In the 2021 snapshot, you can see how they've shifted to organizing based on actions and workflows. Visuals are becoming more specific as well. And it's worth noting that this phase of the docs is still about a year out from the more polished version we saw previously.
The visual organization of the Auth0 docs are useful for highlighting some of our major takeaways from analyzing other documentation sets and their information architectures. We identified 3 areas to improve our information architecture in: the front end, the back end, and the nav bar. By front end, we mean the aspects of a documentation's information architecture that the user sees. An effective front-end IA helps build a user's mental model by breaking the product and its use into discrete components and phases, with user-focused and goal-based approaches. Regardless of whether you want to look up information or learn about the product from scratch, the docs suggest clear signposting and directions. Meanwhile, on the back end, we're seeing a much more organized and developed schema at play, one that the user might not necessarily notice. Terms and folders are explicitly defined, and there's little overlap in page topics. There's less confusion about where to place documentation when it's created, so it's easier for the user to find it. And finally, there's the navigation bar. The navigation bar is a kind of meeting point for the front-end and back-end concerns in an information architecture. With my background in poetry, I approach it as a synecdoche for the documentation's information architecture. In other words, the nav bar is a small part of the IA that can stand in for the whole thing in order to simplify complexities. That doesn't mean that the navigation bar is equivalent to the IA, but that so many of our concerns are simultaneously present that we can have useful discussions about the IA as a whole by referencing the navigation schema, offloading the baggage of the actual content of the pages to a later point in the project. In other words, because we already decided that we were not creating new content at scale, we focused discussions on the navigation to combine our needs for internal and external organizational improvements in a single object.
Next, we performed a rudimentary content audit to help us understand what categories even belong in the navbar. Some of the glaring issues with the content we mentioned earlier slowed this down. Many pages were a hodgepodge of content types, competing main topics. As such, we captured rough characteristics for most pages to get an idea of what categories of information we need to account for. We took an open-ended approach, assigning topics and content types to help us understand our docs. The audit helped us conceptualize possible models for our reimagined navigation. It helped us propose workflows, debate over terminology, and discuss how certain product usage patterns changes the process. For example, how does a topic or topic area change for users operating their network infrastructure on bare metal VMs as opposed to using an orchestrator? How do we account for these differences without creating unnecessary sprawl? We came to two major decisions. The first was that our content consisted of three general types: concepts and explanations, usage docs, and reference material. Second, our usage docs split into 6 general phases that cover the various product usage cycles. Afterwards, we have what you see here on the screen, a restyled navigation bar that taxonomizes content based on the content type and content topic. There are 2 other things to note about the sidebar. It can be difficult to tell from these top-level screenshots, but we elevated certain topic areas to higher levels in the hierarchy. For example, the conceptual information about Consul and the market it serves are in the top left quadrant of the screen. Consul is known for its service discovery and service mesh features, and based on search queries, these features are a large driver of our web traffic. But those features also have some overlap, and treating them as core organizing principles for understanding our product can make understanding the product difficult. So by organizing the content according to the learning phase, which includes topic areas such as what is Consul and get started, and an upgrade phase, we impose a more scalable way to group sets of topics. The phases are not explicitly labeled, but from top to bottom you can see the progression of phases from learn to upgrade to core usage and so on. The second thing to note about this restyled navigation is that there is no new content. All existing pages were relisted without significant changes.
Of course, in bootstrapping this project in such a short time and with no additional resources to support us, we had no confirmation beforehand that the changes we wanted to introduce would actually improve our documentation and make it more usable. In other words, we didn't have the time or the budget to contract an outside study, and although our ideas made sense to us, would they make sense to other people? So we decided to organize an in-house usability study. This usability study took substantial planning and coordination, but it ended up being one of the most valuable parts of the project. So we want to slow down and go over what we did and what we learned in detail. Running a usability study on your docs, at its most basic level, requires only 3 things: people to use your docs who you can observe, questions that participants use the docs to answer, and hypotheses with variation between them.
Recruiting participants can be difficult. We didn't have the time or resources to find a representative population sample, so we turned to our coworkers. We ended up recruiting about 20 volunteers from different groups across the organization, including product engineers, PMs, education engineers from other product lines, and so on. Everyone had different levels of experience with Consul. For instance, one participant wrote a book on how Consul works, whereas another participant was brand new to HashiCorp and knew nothing about the product before the session. Despite the lack of stricter scientific controls, we were vigilant in our attempts to avoid introducing unknown elements or bias into our results. We wanted to learn how people use the docs, not see how much they already knew about the product. This screenshot from one of the project artifacts shows how we color-coded and grouped participants. Our colleague and I worked with the experimental group, whereas Jeff worked with the control group. He'll talk more about the groups in a moment.
At the same time we were recruiting, we were designing questions. We intentionally designed these questions to help us understand user behavior. We didn't ask arbitrary questions. They were thoroughly predefined so that we could observe as much discrete behavior about docs usage as possible. The current slide shows some of the work we did to plan what questions we would ask. When writing the text of a question, we made sure to include a user role. Our product cuts across numerous positions within a platform team, and our docs support a certification program. We wanted to ground each question in reality while evaluating role-based disparities in our docs. We also made sure that there was an actual answer to the question that exists in the docs. Because it's a usability study, it's important that people are actually using the docs to find answers. That's our goal, and in some sense why the docs exist in the first place. We also identified ideal paths to reflect our hypothesized user journeys. Organizational decisions were made because of how we understand our docs to implicitly and explicitly communicate information. So we wanted to find out if those decisions were too rooted in our own perspectives instead of user needs. Content type and complexity were efforts to control our results. If we ask an expert an extremely easy question, they're certain to know where to look. And if we ask our hardest questions to our most inexperienced users, we probably won't learn much either. So it's not a double-blind study. It's a carefully curated study.
Each task also had a set of goals that were intended to help us understand different aspects of our documentation. For example, are associations between major concepts clearly described? When asked to complete certain types of tasks, such as details about a configuration item, which sections do people check first? Are certain text formatting decisions helpful or are they distracting? What do users do when they don't find the information they're looking for? What inferences do they make when information is available? The things we wanted to learn affected how we designed the questions. In some cases, questions were intentionally a little unintuitive, so we could see how people would browse the docs when they weren't sure exactly what they were looking for. By asking the same set of questions for each task across a pool of participants with different levels of expertise, we were trying to get a variety of data points. This is what we mean by variation from the usability study. A study that tries to intentionally guide users or focuses too much on creating positive experiences doesn't really help us as a usability study. You want different people with different backgrounds and experience levels. You want different kinds of questions, and you want unexpected and varied experiences so you can learn as much about the docs as possible. Quantitatively measured studies tend to control for variation, so this aspect of the study may seem counterintuitive. But if you assume that every user behaves the same way, then it doesn't matter if the study has 1 participant, 10, or 100. We weren't drawing from a representative example population, so we intentionally drafted questions that would cause users to behave in different and varied ways.
We divided participants into 3 groups. 2 groups were given the questions with the redesigned navigation bar, and 1 group was given the questions with the existing documentation. We reasoned that we could record the amount of time it took a participant to find information, as well as the number of clicks, and thereby generate quantitative proof that the new design was an improvement. When we held each session, we began by reading a script that instructed the participants and set the terms of our interactions. We wanted to limit our own interactions to asking questions and prompting participants to talk through their decision-making process. We scheduled 30-minute appointments, reserving 5 minutes for instructions and explanations, 20 minutes for the study, and 5 minutes for closing thoughts and comments. Sessions were held on Zoom, with participants sharing their screen as they responded to questions. We recorded each session and included a statement in our scripted introduction. I am hitting record on our session now, to ensure that it was impossible for us to accidentally hold a session without recording it.
The results of our study were dramatically different from what we thought we would learn when we started. The most common behavior we saw across all experience levels and information architectures was that people wanted to search, not browse. Google is the primary search tool, and in-page search tools are the secondary. There was one exception to this behavior that we observed across all participant levels and groups. When the task was related to Kubernetes, people went straight to the Kubernetes topic in the navigation bar. I want to point out one of the painful tactical lessons we learned during the actual sessions. That is, if you are running an experimental group with a mock website, make sure that it works properly, because the new IA had been stitched together for demonstration purposes. It did not contain all of the redirects between pages necessary to function properly. 2 of the sessions saw participants encounter frequent 400 and 500 errors as a result. If our experimental sessions had its issues, we were learning quite a bit about the content problems in the existing docs. We observed participants effectively navigate to the page containing the answer, only to scroll back and forth and ultimately miss it due to the unwieldy blocks of text and unstandardized page structures. In this example, not only is a critical piece of reference information buried in what is technically an overview page, it is also poorly written and would probably violate anyone's style guide. Also, what is usage information doing in an overview page?
After the usability study, we had further conversations with 2 of the SMEs that participated. They made additional suggestions and refinements to our proposed navigation schema, but their suggestions would have required significant effort to not only revise, but greatly expand the available content in the documentation. We butted up against our North Star principle. Fixing the IA, like the examples we saw from the Auth0 docs, is a multi-year project that takes planning and follow-through. But we learned enough about our docs in our usability study that we were able to propose and execute deliverables that had a measurable impact on the quality of our documentation. Because search was king, we decided to begin improving our information architecture by attending to the searchability of our documentation. We weren't happy with our documentation's internal search tool, which leveraged the page title and description in the metadata and organized results alphabetically. But this capability was not changing in our new developer portal. So we examined data in Google Search Console to find out what searches were sending people to our documentation and which pages they were sent to. We noticed that a number of queries were going to only a few overview pages, such as, what is console? And console reference architecture. Those pages didn't necessarily have the answers to users' queries, but they had enough combinations of keywords that they were driving traffic.
So we took a 2-pronged approach to improving our IA for search. I took responsibility for refreshing the content on our most visited pages. Pages such as the API documentation landing page demonstrate some of the most significant improvements we made. Overall, our goal was to use these highly trafficked pages as landing pages that contain links to relevant docs. The idea was to create more avenues for finding information from these pages that were already receiving the majority of traffic.
I, meanwhile, undertook a content refresh of the page metadata. I read through each page, adjusted the title to be more descriptive, and tracked pages to make sure titles weren't repeated. For page descriptions, I wrote a few boilerplate templates for different content types and used those to generate a couple hundred unique page descriptions that contained terms and variations that we wanted Google Search to be responsive to. There were a lot of challenges to balance in writing these descriptions. Because Google limits results to the first 160 characters of the description, we wanted to be sure those characters contained enough descriptive information for a user to know they were on the page that would help them. Here you see the rewritten description for the What is Console page, which takes the 160 character limit to heart.
These efforts had a significant impact on our findability and engagement. Not only did the internal search tool return more appropriate results, our overall page rankings and click-through rates also improved. At the same time, we laid the groundwork for the continued information architecture work we've completed since then. For instance, we've continued to define our documentation content types and refactor existing content into standardized pages. As part of our efforts to create standard content types, Jeff started creating design docs that provide rationale for formatting decisions and include examples. We've also begun to evolve our long-term plan with regard to organizing documentation by phase, which we've applied to a small set of docs around the SaaS edition of Console. The response has been positive so far. I should also point out that as the longest tenured technical writing team at HashiCorp, other product lines are beginning to mount their own long-term IA initiatives. Our work to fix the IA is ongoing, and like Auth0, we see these as long-term efforts to improve a documentation set.
We want to end our presentation by emphasizing some of the lessons we learned about analyzing and improving your doc's IA, especially when running an in-house usability study. Some of these lessons are things that we believe you can work on right away and will apply to virtually all of your docs. Others are lessons about the study or communications with stakeholders that we think you should bear in mind when attempting a homegrown IA improvement project. Lesson number 1, optimize for search. There's no getting away from the fact that when users want answers, they're going to search. They're going to start searching on Google, but if they end up in your docs, they're going to use available search functions to navigate the information. Introducing design changes to improve documentation searchability may be the single most important thing you can do to improve the usability of your docs. We don't think this is going to change either. Numerous recent stories have emphasized the increasing unfamiliarity with directory structure among computer science students. What that means exactly is going to depend on your docs. For us, we were able to optimize for both internal and external searches by addressing the same metadata field, but that was a function of our existing search tool. Had our internal tool used other processes to search our documentation, our approach to optimizing for search may have needed modifications.
Lesson number 2, use the docs you have. At the beginning of the project, we were eager to move fast and break things so we could really make big impact changes. But the combination of the usability study and discussions around redesigning the IA really highlighted the fact that our existing docs were extremely valuable in terms of getting insights about how people tend to use the docs. This shouldn't be surprising. Of course, we learn more about our existing docs by studying them and discussing them instead of making up new ones. We wanted to avoid wasting valuable time when talking about the docs with engineers and other SMEs. As a result, we placed a great deal of focus on some future state of the docs. But to be clear, there is no wasted time in conducting an in-house usability study on your docs exactly as they exist right now. For those of you who face pushback on this idea, this presentation is now professional research citation to back you up. Study your existing docs.
Lesson number 3, come up with a plan and North Star principle ahead of time. Our North Star principle that we needed to reorganize content instead of writing new content wasn't something that we thought would be so important at the start of the project. We agreed upon it relatively early in the process because we were hesitant about accepting a project to fix the IA before anybody could agree on what that actually meant. In some ways, we just wanted to ensure that stakeholders didn't start to expect results that we never would be able to deliver. But our North Star goal came back after the usability study, when it was time to commit to a plan of action. We had a lot of good feedback from our SMEs about the IA, and there was a part of us that kept thinking, well, let's just try to redo the whole set of docs. It won't be that much work. The North Star was instrumental in helping us define our deliverables, keep us on the same page, and break a standstill when trying to figure out how to actually proceed with the project.
Lesson number 4. Focus on qualitative observations of docs, not quantitative. Especially for those of us in technical verticals, you can feel pressure to prove your claims as true with the logic of cold, hard numbers. But our experience while running our usability study didn't bear this idea out. There is absolutely a place for numbers and quantitative observations about your docs, but the most useful data we obtained over the course of this project, especially early on, was observing other people use a docs and asking them questions. When we discussed our observations with each other, we were able to really understand where our docs were falling short.
Lesson number 5. Embrace and beware the navbar trap when communicating with stakeholders. As we mentioned earlier, we found the navigation bar to be an especially useful way for talking about our information architecture. Virtually all of our concerns are compressed into a hierarchy with short and unique names, and together they reinforce the understanding and usage of the product. But that's not all information architecture is. Improving your docs IA is a long-term project that takes enormous effort and follow-through. It means creating design docs that describe the elements in their order on the page, that define terms and organizational principles explicitly, that connect the available functions in your content creation and management systems with the components that display the docs. There's no easy fix to it, and no single object or deliverable. Set those expectations early. We think one of the biggest potential pitfalls to this work is underselling the scope of an information architecture project to stakeholders.
You can learn a lot about your docs and come up with ideas for improving them without extra resources. But there's one resource you need in order to make meaningful work on your information architecture, and that's time. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for listening. We look forward to answering your questions and continuing the conversation.
So the question that we have we have some time to answer is, did you do the content audit manually or did you use a specific tool?
The only tool we really used was Excel or Google Sheets. So, we have a Docs as Code workflow, so we used a script to export all of the files.
Okay.
But Adam can speak to his experience. I was still a few months into my role with the company, so I was still learning about the product. But so it was useful to skim pages and try to summarize them. But our work was very exploratory at that point, right? We didn't know what we were looking for. So we were just trying to go through pages and say, we are seeing these kinds of documentation types on these pages. We're seeing these topics on these pages, because we didn't want to assume that the existing organizational schemes were the best way to do it, right?
Yeah, we were planning, basically we were planning 1 foot, the next step. We didn't have a holistic, we didn't have a lot of time to make the change that was being asked of us. So we said, let's look at the content we have, and we exported all the URLs, started kind of trying to eyeball it, and then that kind of evolved into, looks like this is going to be our content audit, and so we moved forward that way. And we knew that we were going to need to do some testing on whatever it was that we came up with, and so that's when we started kind of rolling into some of the other processes. So it was never we had 2 months ahead of time to figure out what tools we were going to use, how we were going to approach this thing, and everything that we wanted to do. We had 2 weeks to figure out the next step. And so, I think one of the alternate titles was going to be quick and dirty usability testing. Right.
Right.
So yeah, we didn't have time to research tools and better ways to do it. I think now that we have this framework, we'll definitely look at some of these, remote testing kind of tools and some of these other ways to do the same sort of things, because we definitely need to do it again as we get to different versions of documentation.
Yeah, there were definitely some suggestions in the chat. Oh, one more question. How did you handle keeping the docs up to date while also re-architecting them? This is a great question. I love this. Did you double author and then cut over to the new site? This is like the pain of every documentarian. So how did you do it?
Yeah, this is the big challenge, right? And to some degree, it just requires holding in your head what the docs are going to be a few months in the future and what they are now, and trying to just do the work once. But I would like part of what we did was that once we like did this content audit, we started with our reference materials. I think we identified that as some of the most relevant to the developers, and also as one of the most static domains, right? So this technical specification to configure the product, we might add new ones or deprecate some, but they're largely not changing, right? So I think figuring out how to present that as a content type and doing those pages were like the starting step in all of this. And then we moved into, some of the more dynamic pages that were changing as we were trying to redo the IA.
Yeah. Copious notes. And that's this is what, here's the heading for what it is now, what it's going to be. Exactly what Jeff said. It's just.
Yeah. But it's so iterative, right? You got to make the change, go back and it's always going.
Well, I love what Abby said. It's always hard doing two things. She said this is in chat. It's always hard doing two things at once, laying tracks in front of a speeding train. Yeah, that's pretty much what it feels like doing documentation, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that is a very appropriate metaphor there. I love that metaphor. So I think we're about ready for the closing statement, which is going to be held right here in just a little bit. I think that was our last question, but I know that there were other questions, and you two got a lot of engagement. So you might suggest that people message you, give them some sort of contact information, some way for them to get up with you and continue to talk about this, because we are all behind the idea of re-architecting a site that is really not operating the way it should. So that is our life. Am I right? I feel like I'm doing that constantly right now.
Yeah, well, I think we're both in the Slack channel. So please, hit us up.
Yeah, that's a good way to contact them. Then look for them in Slack. You can DM them. You can look for them on, I guess, the Write the Doc Conferences channel. Yeah, okay, perhaps other places. So let's give them lots of clap emojis. I see some clap emojis in chat, and sign language emojis, clapping. Well done. Thank you very much. And you were really a great way to kind of bring this conference to a close. Thank you for such a great talk with such interesting content.